So for sketching, as usual, I'll be using my favorite Prismacolor Kohl Erase in purple and a Winsor & Newton sketchbook with Bristol paper. So my technique of drawing bodies is mostly based on dividing the body into geometrical shapes and then building the whole body drawing on that construction. And first thing I'm always doing is I'm lightly sketching the shapes for the head, torso, hips and legs. And with this very light outline, I can right away see if the proportions I drew are good before I go in with any harsher outline. So for the head, I'm just drawing an oval shape with two lines of symmetry, one going horizontally and one vertically, and I'm not gonna go in depth with how I draw head and how I draw the face, because I already did a tutorial on that, so please check it out if you want to know some more details, the link is in the card. Then for the torso, I'm always sketching this kind of trapeze shape that is broader on top. The two upper angles of my trapeze shape are going to loosely indicate the arms. Then I'm marking the hip area, and I'm also sketching a trapeze-like shape, but this time the broader part of it will be at the bottom. Next, I'm loosely sketching those kind of block shapes for the legs. I'm not paying that much attention to the legs just yet, but I'm making sure I'm marking the kneecaps in the correct place by drawing circles. And lastly, I'm sketching the arms. Their length should always be around the upper 1/3 of the thigh. So that's pretty much our correctly constructed base for building the actual drawing of the body. So now what we want to do is to add some volume to our construction. And here we need to be aware of the fact that human body doesn't have any straight and harsh lines or angles. Everything should be kind of rounded and flowy to give us that 3D effect that we're going for. And at this point, if you're a beginner artist, you might want to use some reference pictures to see how exactly the human body is shaped, so you can sketch it out minding every little detail, like for example, how wide the shoulders should be in relation to the torso, where should the cleavage area be in relation to the neck, and so on and so forth. I also feel like it's quite important to emphasize the fact that all of the bodies are different, and what I'm drawing and what I'm showing you today is my kind of most standard silhouette with the most neutral and basic proportions. You can always alternate your body sketch and its proportions by, for example, making the legs longer or shorter or drawing the hips wider. But this requires the knowledge of the proportions and basics of anatomy to be able to freely design all of the body types you want. But anyway, in this step, I'm just following the construction lines and I'm adding the volume to each part of the body, minding its curves and all the joints. And once I'm happy with what the sketch looks like and I checked if all the proportions are correct, I'm going to lightly erase the whole sketch with my kneaded eraser, and then I'm gonna take my mechanical pencil and I'm gonna outline the whole drawing again to refine it one last time. And this is how I managed to create a nice and clean sketch of female body by using, in my opinion, quite simple and intuitive method of dividing the body into shapes. And now, before we're gonna move on to a little bit more complicated poses, I'm gonna break down the shapes of each body part that we just drew to make it even easier and more understandable for you, so once we start with more advanced poses, you'll know how to approach them. So first we're gonna start with the torso. You already know that I drew it as a trapeze shape. But it's only gonna be this very straight trapeze shape when we're drawing a standing straight figure. If we want to do a pose with some kind of movement of the body, our trapeze is gonna bend in lots of angles, sides and directions. It might also get slightly broader on top in some occasions or slightly more narrow at the bottom. It all really depends on the pose. But it's really essential that you don't treat it as a geometrical figure that needs to be drawn using a ruler, but you should treat it as a shape that can be bent or alternated in any kind of angle or direction. And as you can see, I also like to use the lines of symmetry to mark the directions that my torso will bend towards. Next on, we have the pelvis and hip area. Here goes the exact same rule as with the torso. The trapeze we're gonna draw to indicate the hips should be also flexible and bendable. Always try to think of the fact that human body is not a piece of wood, but is actually very flexible and made of soft tissues that are three-dimensional. And here, when you're drawing hips, you always want to make sure that hips are in the correct place in regards to the torso. So that's why I'm drawing those kind of mini silhouettes to set everything in place and get a good grasp of all the proportions. And you can see that if the hip area is drawn correctly, you can basically come up with any kind of leg positioning you want and connect them with the hips. And now for the legs. I tend to draw them either as lines or some kind of blocks at first, to later on add some volume to them. But here is also very important to start with the pelvis area to indicate the directions that the legs should go towards. And then, for example, if we draw our trapeze for the hip area and it's going up on one side and down on the other side, that will indicate the fact that also one of the legs should be placed higher and the other one should be placed proportionally lower. It's really hard to explain all of that, but I really hope that you guys can understand what I mean by both listening to me and looking at what I'm drawing. So now let's move on to the fun part, sketching the poses. For the first pose, I want the whole weight of the silhouette to be on one leg. That means one of the hips should be also higher than the other one, and then the torso should be proportionally bent considering the curve of the hip area. I also feel like one of the hands should be on the hip and then the other one will be in a natural straight position, leaning on the side of the body. At the end, I'm drawing the head somewhere above the torso, just in the middle. I usually prefer to start with the head, but sometimes it's more convenient to do it in an opposite manner. Then I'm just gonna go over with slightly thicker outline, and then I'm gonna start outlining the whole body, starting with the head this time, because it's always the best to start with the head, like I mentioned, and it always sets the proportions for the whole body the best. Then with my previously mentioned technique, I'm outlining the construction, adding proper volume to the body and minding all curves of it. One trick I can really recommend is if you want to draw a certain body pose and you just can't find a proper reference picture, just stand in front of the camera or in front of the mirror and strike the same kind of pose you want to draw. Then you'll be able to notice every little detail and the things we tend to forget when we try drawing body from memory. And I can't really stress enough how this little trick helps while drawing bodies, because sometimes it takes hours and hours to find good reference picture, and well, you always have your phone on you and you can always take a quick picture and then just base your drawing off of it. So that's really simple and I really recommend that. But anyway, once I'm happy with the body sketch, I'm outlining the shape of it with the mechanical pencil, and then I have a great base for further details and creating a full illustration with it. Next pose will be slightly turned to the side and it will show a bit of like walking movement. Again, I'm starting off with two trapeze shapes and an oval for the head. I'm already thinking about the directions and the sides my body will be pointing towards. Then I'm sketching a couple of lines for the legs and hands. I'm constantly checking if everything is proportionate in relation to the other body parts. Then once the construction is complete, I'm adding the volume to the body and I'm creating the silhouette. I always like to add those little details like the collarbone indication because it helps to set the proportions between the head, neck and the chest. I also like adding a slight curve to the breast area. I also like making the crotch area visible because it really helps when you're drawing jeans, for example. And then I'm also marking the kneecaps because that just sets everything in place. And well, this is how our second silhouette is completed. And for the last pose, I want to sketch a girl that is turned to the side, opposite to the one we just drew, and she's gonna have a slightly more static and stable pose, with her legs being placed slightly wider on the ground. Here the process is exactly the same like with two previous silhouettes. Here the tricky part are going to be the legs. The torso is slightly bent to the back and the hips are rather straight, so the legs should be placed in such a manner to balance this situation that is happening with the torso. The legs should give you a sense of stability and balance when it comes to this pose, so the natural thing is that they would be slightly spread apart to counteract the bend of the back. And even though this pose might seem like it's quite easy, it was honestly the hardest and the most tricky one of these three, even for me, because this leg situation is quite complicated and you need to figure out the best way to balance your whole body weight. And well, this is pretty much how we created the third and at the same time the last body pose.